So our next talk is about natural disasters, and our speaker, Roger Abbott, again, very well qualified to speak in this arena. He's been in ordained ministry for 30 years in the Baptist Church, and but has segued into disaster response. He did his PhD in the practical theology of disaster response, and now is a senior research associate at the Faraday Institute, working on natural disasters, although you'll see that he questions even that phrase itself. So thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you. My assigned task this afternoon is a vexing one, if not a controversial one. Natural disasters whose fault. Given that I did a 3-year project, in Haiti following the devastating earthquake there in 2010, whose fault can be easily answered, it's God's fault. Okay, so we can all go now and move on. If we understand fault to mean a geological fault, then it is God who puts those faults into the creation. But obviously, the question is not using fault in that sense. It's using it in the common sense, in which case almost every occasion in which we define the word fault, something to blame, some wrongdoing, some error, some defectiveness is very much in mind. So basically my task is to explore, if not to assign, who or what is to blame when a so-called natural disaster takes place. A question that is a very common question, certainly in our culture, and a question which I'm going to seek to answer from theology, which is my specialism, and also from science, which isn't. I want to make it clear I'm not a scientist. I'm interested in science. Presumably if I wasn't, I wouldn't be where I am in the Faraday Institute. I'm a theologian primarily, a practical theologian. But I want to persuade you, without any shadow of doubt, that I believe passionately in the partnership between science and religion. And as church leaders, I want to impassion you to go back to your churches, and if there is any lack of belief in this partnership, to get to work stimulating it and promoting it, and never more so, actually, than in the field of so-called natural disasters. What is a natural disaster? Understanding a natural disaster involves understanding natural forces, natural processes, and both theology and science make important contributions to our understanding of those processes. So let's begin with some general information, first of all, about so-called natural disasters, and for the sake of familiarity, we'll stick with that terminology for the moment. In categorizing natural disasters, various criteria are used, and the one on the right-hand side is taken from so-called MDAT, the International Disaster Database. And this gives you some idea of the kind of natural phenomena or natural hazards, as we prefer to call them, that come under the term natural disaster. And as you'll see, there is a lot of hazardous material, a lot of hazardous nature in the International Disaster Database categorization. Geophysical, meteorological, hydrological, climatological, and biological. And note well, the list is a taxonomy of different natural processes, or as I say, natural hazards. That is all we have defined there, okay, and categorized there. And for this reason, it is my growing conviction that it is neither scientifically or theologically accurate to the facts, which I shall go on to elucidate, to list those categories per se as disasters. They are not disasters. They are simply descriptors of the phenomena that are natural. Indeed, they are God created from my perspective as a Christian. So let's look first of all at the theology. Though we should not think of those natural processes as inherently disastrous for humans, obviously they can become such. And we're all too familiar with the terrible way in which they can become such, given certain sets of circumstances. If any of those phenomena you've just seen happened and there were no humans there, they would not be a disaster. And many of them do happen in places where there are no humans, and there's certainly no human loss of life. And they contribute to the very wonderful place that our world is, to the landscape, to the mountains, to the valleys, to the rivers, to the weather. And in that they are part and parcel of God's wonderful mechanism for designing this beautiful place that we live in, and places we travel to and we love to take pictures of, and we ooh and we ah about it. They are not disasters per se. Interestingly, of course, the Hebrew culture and language didn't have and doesn't have a word for nature as such. It just speaks of creation, the Creator's work. And that word good is a very familiar one, of course, as far as the Bible is concerned, going right back to the book of Genesis when it speaks of God's work in creation. It is a good work. And that's often how creation in the Bible is referred to. And interestingly, and certainly not to be ignored, and is the way sometimes those hazards are actually phenomenon which provoke worship of God, the Creator. For instance, in Psalm 104, we have these words in verse 31 and onwards: "May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works." We say amen to that. "Who looks on the earth and it trembles. Who touches the mountains and they smoke." Where did that kind of imagery come from? "I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being." Praise and worship that is inspired by natural phenomenon such as we have already categorized. But how can such a staggeringly awesome process become disastrous? Has something changed in these created processes now that makes them disastrous? Or has something changed in us as humans that makes them disastrous? Or both? Should Christians, for instance, be praying that God would take away volcanoes and earthquakes, floods and viruses and bugs? Should that be what we're praying for? Dr. Carmen Hara, best-selling author, clinical psychologist and relationships expert, said or asked, "Can you imagine a world with no tornadoes, hurricanes or earthquakes? A planet free from natural disasters?" You see the link? Millions of lives would be saved each year. What do you say to that? Are you looking forward to a world that has no earthquakes, no volcanoes, no weather? Is that what we should be looking for? Is the problem intimated in Genesis 3, for instance, which speaks about things occurring both to humans and to nature? The ground being cursed because of you, said God. Or in Romans 8, which speaks of the creation being subject to futility and therefore groaning as it awaits a full redemption. In other words, has God inserted some kind of natural Trojan virus into these natural processes that must inexorably lead to them crashing? Is that the problem? I find this account in Job to be absolutely fascinating one. And God took Job on a kind of natural history tour. And in Job 38 verse 2, before he took Job on that tour, God said to Job, because Job, you remember, had been pouring out his bitterness, his complaints to God as to why he would allow these terrible things to happen to him. You remember he lost his possessions, his riches, his wealth, his status, his social status, his children. And then was afflicted with that terrible, terrible disease. And unsurprisingly, trying to come to terms with this, as his friends, so-called, accused him, you must have done something wrong, Job, otherwise this thing would never happen. And he protested his innocence relative to the degree of terror that had happened to him. And at the end of his laments, for which he was never actually condemned, interestingly, God said to him, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" And then in the intervening chapters from Job 38 and onwards to 41, he takes Job on a journey of his natural phenomena, takes him through the natural world, the animal world, the meteorological world, the climatological world. And at the end of it all, Job has to say to God, "Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know." But of course, if you go back to what we call the creation mandate in Genesis chapter 1, these were things that Adam and Eve were mandated to know. They were mandated to explore the world that God had given them. They didn't fully understand it, but they had the potential to do so, and they were commanded to do so and encouraged to do so. But something, alas, went terribly wrong. And Job acknowledges that. I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. And there you have the creation mandate. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing. And of course there's a whole theology that's been built around that, which has said, well, there's our task. We have to have dominion over this creation. It's hostile, it's unfriendly, it's untamed, and it's our job as human beings under God to tame the animal. So creation is seen as being a kind of enemy something that's wild and that human beings are mandated to and have the power to control and contain and to bring into subjection, so that we have the dominion, not creation, not the natural world. What a terrible misunderstanding and misinterpretation of that whole concept of the creation mandate that is. Where we are really encouraged to be stewards, to be managers, to be God's vice regents, managing his creation. And that means getting to know it, to understand it, identifying how that creation should be treated, how humans should be able to live with that creation as a friend, not as a killer, as an enemy. So the theology, beyond any doubt in my view, persuades us that it isn't, as it were, God who has screwed up. In theological terms, it is we who have screwed up. The earth is cursed, the ground is cursed because of you. And we have that statement in Proverbs 8 where wisdom is anthropomorphized, as it were. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth, before he had made the earth with its field, or the first of the dust of the world, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the children of men. And then later on in that chapter you have these significant words, for whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord, but he who fails to find me injures himself. I think that's a very powerful and telling theological statement. Upon our failure to retain that wisdom that God ordained the first humans to seek for and to develop in their understanding of the natural world, we have lost that wisdom. And we're now finding that we're injuring ourselves. We're now fighting nature as an enemy, and nature is fighting back. Coming to the science informs us and assures us that not only is the creation validated by theology, it is also made explicable by the sciences, especially by the hard sciences, the natural sciences. This is a case because under the creatorship of an infinitely intelligent God, we have a creation, we have a natural world that in many respects operates by complex laws and systems that are accessible to scientific investigation and responsive to the creation mandate for humans to manage and to steward the creation in a harmless way. Thus, by this stage in human life on Earth, the development of scientific exploration and knowledge is, quite frankly, nothing short of phenomenal and breathtaking. We have made huge strides in geophysical understanding, locating tectonics and seismology, mapping, seismography of faults, safe construction models and methods, building codes and enforcement, safe evacuation and safe shelter, disaster mitigation. We've made huge strides in these. The realm of meteorological hazards. weather patterns, forecasting and tracking, severe weather alerts, evacuations, safe shelters, again, disaster mitigation, hydrological phenomenon, climatological phenomenon, and even biological phenomenon. We have made huge strides in all of these, and relative to the amount of science that is available to us and accessible to us, that so many people still die from natural hazards is quite frankly inexcusable by any measure. So we come back to this categorization again. This planet, even nurtured and formed and sustained by phenomenon like these, is a breathtaking place. These are pictures from places where I have carried out my field research. Aren't they beautiful? Aren't they beautiful? And yet thousands and thousands of people have died in these places. So we must be careful as well not to take these categories as one-offs, as individuals. It's very interesting in the field of disaster research now. Geographers and geologists are talking more about cascading disasters. What they mean is that a geophysical disaster can actually lead to a hydrological disaster. And so it goes on. Each of these is not just an individual level. They interact with each other. They set off disasters in a kind of chain. And the fact that they kill so many people and cascade in that way is as I say, inexcusable. So I think David Hart, who wrote that book, you may have read it immediately after the Asian tsunami in 2004, he's quite correct when in his book, Doors of the Sea, he summed up the place of natural hazards in creation when he wrote, in the words before you, "Of course, volcanoes are necessary, but for them and the seismic shocks that follow from these instabilities, and the oceans of fire form the Earth's mantle, this planet almost certainly could not produce and sustain the atmosphere that incubates and shelters terrestrial life, nor would its soils be so fertile, nor its range of temperatures so equable. Indeed, ironically enough, the extraordinary fecundity and beauty of the northeastern rim of the Indian Ocean is in large part a result of countless millennia of volcanic activity and tectonic strife." So in summary, both the theology and the science point to these facts. We live in a dynamic world where natural created events are continuously occurring, and these can be hazardous to humans but not impossible to live safely with. The Earth is a constantly mobile, fluid and hazardous creation, a fact that humans have to learn to collaborate with and not to assume mastery over. We humans need both the scientific and theological wisdom to cooperate with nature, or else natural hazards will become exacerbated as disastrous phenomena. And critical to disaster mitigation and risk reduction is the partnership between science and theology. It is our moral and theological responsibility to collaborate, theology and science, in the interests of saving lives and livelihoods. So then, whose fault is it when natural hazards happen? There are a number of candidates. We could imagine nature, because it's just disastrous. It's what nature does. It's God, dare I say it, because there's something about him that is disastrous. It's what he does. There are cosmic beings, spirits, Satan, evil, because that's the dominant power in this world. Or it's because of humans who are fundamentally warped. So those are the candidates. What's the evidence? And here I want to take you to my own research. And I'm going to have to be very general. So I'm going to put up some slides, and I'm going to have to go through them very quickly. I'm going to take you to projects that I did or the results of projects that I've done following Hurricane Katrina, which happened in the Gulf of Mexico and in New Orleans and the Mississippi Delta in 2005, to the Haiti earthquake in 2010, to Super Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines in 2013, and maybe, if we get time, the flooding of the village of Moreland on the Somerset levels in 2014. Going first to the Haiti earthquake. No, Hurricane Katrina. We'll do it chronologically. What do we say about Hurricane Katrina? If I'm right, then Hurricane Katrina was a natural phenomenon. You may be aware that hurricanes are frequent annual visitors to the Caribbean and even to the Gulf of Mexico. And hurricanes actually do a lot of good. They do a lot of good in terms of affecting the coastal tides, in terms of seed distribution, plant distribution and generation. They affect tides, they affect weather patterns, and they are excellent cleansers of the atmosphere, if we may say. So why did Hurricane Katrina, which swept across, filled in fact the Gulf of Mexico as a Category 5 hurricane, when it missed New Orleans as a Category 3 hurricane, which is not unique or new to New Orleanians, why did it flood 80% of the city and lead to the deaths of something in the region of 1,800 people, and the loss of livelihoods, and the distribution of the population through evacuation of the majority of the population of New Orleans and the metropolitan New Orleans? Well, there's a whole series of issues which are listed up there. Historically and vulnerably, New Orleans was founded in a vulnerable location. And the reason it came to be there was largely political, because there was a big fight going on between the Spanish and the French and the Brits as to who could conquer the Mississippi. Because if you conquered the Mississippi, you conquered the USA. It was the artery for commercial purposes, for military purposes, into the whole of the dominance of the USA. So they chose to build it on a small area of natural levees formed by the Mississippi. And as long as they stayed on that levee, they would be okay. But it was only a small area. But commercial purposes again took over, and expansionism and human hubris to show who could conquer the USA and who could conquer the Mississippi. They expanded the city. So they began to fill in the swampland behind it and to develop it. And you know what happens when you develop swamplands? Sorry to those of you who live on reclaimed land. It dries out and it sinks. And that's exactly what has been happening ever since New Orleans was formed and still is ongoing to this very day. And so you get a bowl effect. And in order to protect that bowl, you have to build a man-made levee system around it. And that is really what has been going on. In addition to that, they said, well, this Mississippi River, we're human beings, that's just nature, that's got to be tamed, so we're going to tame the Mississippi River. Instead of it telling us where it wants to go, we're going to tell it where to go. And so they began to levee the Mississippi River and to tell the Mississippi River where to go, okay? Now, the Mississippi River brings down with it, it's a bit like the sewage system for the whole of the United States of America, I'm sorry, but it brings down all the gumph and gunk from the upper states of the America down, and where does it go? Well, it goes out at the moment into the Gulf of Mexico over the edge of the cliff, as it were. The Mississippi here has always wanted to move. Historically, it is always, the delta has always wanted to move, and it lays down silt. Okay? And in that silt grow mangroves, cypress trees, all kinds of grasses and reeds, and it also builds up sandbanks and mud banks, and those are very wonderful things because they suppress the power of hurricanes and storm surges. Okay? Are you with me? If the river cannot lay down those sediments, then every storm and tidal movement gradually erodes those natural storm breaks away. And today they are eroding at the rate of an American football pitch every 45 minutes. And consequently, New Orleans in 2005 was an exceedingly vulnerable city. By 2050, the sea, the high tide mark, could be right up to the man-made levee of New Orleans. And all those natural wetlands and storm surge absorbents will have disappeared. New Orleans did not have to be flooded. As I told you, the hurricane missed the city, and in fact, why it flooded was that the man-made levee system was not built as it should have been built, and it collapsed, and in came the tide. It collapsed. The Army Corps of Engineers were built to build it, but they were building it on a limited budget, and they built it defectively. That is beyond doubt now, and the rest is appalling history. Let's go to the Haiti earthquake. Again, an historically vulnerable location, Port-au-Prince, the capital city of Haiti, is built slap bang on a seismically active fault line, the Enriquelot Plantain Garden Fault. Already had flattened Haiti, Port-au-Prince rather, albeit in a much reduced form back in 1751, 1770 or 75. And then you have historic centralization going on in the capital city, gain due to national and also foreign policy agendas, which encourage or discourage the development of agriculture, which is the traditional and majority development in Haiti, close down the agriculture, move the people into the cities. Why? Because foreign companies then have cheap labor. So there was this encouragement of mobilization, both under the Duvaliers and under almost every successive regime in Haiti, to move people into Port-au-Prince with the lure of the promise of employment, superior employment, higher paid employment, that never actually happened. So they closed down their farms, they came into the city. They maybe have worked for a little while, but then it dried up, and then they had to, they just got by in the slums. And the whole development of Port-au-Prince, you have 3 million people, and they have to live somewhere, and they can't afford the building codes, even if the building codes were in existence, which they're not. And so, because of the very geography and geology of the place, when the 7.0 earthquake happened, those buildings fell. And so many of those people died beneath them. And then very quickly to the Philippines, to the little island of Bantian Island off the northern tip of Cebu in central Philippines. The super typhoon Yolanda swept through that, the largest, the most powerful typhoon to make landfall at that time, swept through. It didn't take many lives. It did kill some people, but it decimated the livelihoods of the people of the island, most of whom lived on the seashore because they were fishermen. And they lived there because traditionally that was their livelihood, that was their chief means of income. And the super typhoon swept through, it destroyed their boats, it destroyed their homes, and it destroyed their livelihoods. But typhoons are regular phenomenon in the Philippines. They're not unique. They weren't unique to 2014. They happened. They are survivable. If you choose to live in appropriate places, in appropriately built habitations. And that just wasn't the case. And again, that wasn't the case due to poverty, and poverty due to political shenanigans, corruption, and to, again, it must be said, foreign policy interventions. I'll pass on from Moreland. I just want to close with this quote from John Sobrino, Father John Sobrino, El Salvadorian. He works in El Salvador. He's a liberation theologian, actually. But in his very moving and powerful book, Where is God? Earthquake, Terrorism, Barbarity, he writes this statement: in today's context, it has been easier to apply suspicion and critical judgment to God, whom we do not see, than to the reality that human beings have created, which we see very well. And the one thing that my own research has enabled me to see is exactly that, the human factors. And we are all implicated in those, actually, even in things that happen the other side of the world or in the poor nations that we love to respond to with our aid and our generosity when terrible things happen. Dear friends, we need to ask the question, what can we do to stop those people becoming so vulnerable as they are when these things happen? And that is a lot more heart-searching than simply asking the question, what can I give now that something has happened to help them recover? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. And I'm sure there are lots of questions. Yes, Frank at the back.
You've given us a really interesting talk and closely reasoned, and I can understand the whole logic of what you've been saying from the point of view of an almighty and all-powerful God and the stupidity of fallen humans.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not disagreeing with anything you've said in that respect, but it does leave me very concerned about certain points.
Mm-hmm.
Every time, if we have something fairly obvious, like a very badly built high-rise building, and there's an earth tremor, and it all comes down, we say, human fault, and we sort of, as it were, exonerate God. So that's an easy one.
Yeah.
You've given the rationale of some of these disasters, like New Orleans and so on, which I follow through and understand the reasoning all right, based on the concept of an all-powerful God. Thinking back to an earlier one, I think it was the 2004 tsunami in the oceans, which was so widespread because of the whole
Yes.
rim of the ocean. I find it very difficult to sort of say, this was all just humans being stupid and so on. There are a lot of people totally innocent from the point of view of this phenomenon who were absolutely devastated as a result of this phenomenon.
Yeah.
Can be explained, the reasons for it all can be explained and so on, no problem. But I'd just like a word from you about the almighty God, all-powerful God, doing all these things, fine, and we worship him for the glory of creation, fine, but where is the loving God in all this?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And maybe I should have said more on that, but in the time that I had. Anyway, and it comes out in the question that is often asked, actually often asked by those who live in relatively safe environments, where was God when such and such happened? One can answer that in a number of ways, I think, but principally, as a Christian, I appeal to the way people respond to these things, the fact that when one of these events happen, we've spoken a lot about the worst of human nature, but we also see a resurgence of the best of human nature in terms of the volume of human compassion and human action that responds to help these situations. There is a kind of bonding and oneness when the rest of the world, so to speak, responds to one of these. And it's interesting interviewing, and I've interviewed hundreds of people who have survived these incidents, and that is always something that they bring to my attention. We have been so moved, we've been so helped, we've been so grateful for the way people have moved to help us. And they see that as being a wonderful provision of God. You asked the question, sir, and quite rightly so, but one of the startling conclusions or results from the work that I've done is that hardly anyone I have interviewed, and in fact no one seriously, has blamed God for what's happened to them. They really haven't. That doesn't mean they haven't been confused. That doesn't mean they've perfectly understood why it's happened to them. That doesn't mean that they haven't, with tears, poured out their sorrow and their pain to God. So they have lamented to God, but they have never blamed God. Now, I don't know what I'm just telling you the results of my research, okay? when it comes to the 2004 tsunami, which you mentioned, it did affect many countries. And if you pick beneath the surface of what happened in those countries, you will find that in so many cases, it's certainly the case in Sri Lanka and in the little piece of India that was affected, and in the Indian Ocean Islands, was the case in Banda Aceh in Indonesia, in Phuket and Thailand. There were a whole range of political issues going on and social economic issues going on that placed people in very vulnerable locations. It is not without significance that so many of the people who died, I really got annoyed when I read of a prominent preacher, theologian, saying that maybe the reason the Asian tsunami happened was in judgment of those topless bathers that go holidaying in Phuket. Do you know the majority of the people who died in Phuket were not holiday makers? They were children of the fishermen and the fisher families that lived in almost abject poverty along the coastlines. Those are the people who died. And no sooner did the tsunami do its devastation than the landlords came in and sold up whole areas of coastline to elite business people wanting to set up hotels there. So you have all that kind of, I say, evil going on in these situations. But those people who survive that, the people who live there, who survive there, it's interesting that they don't turn their hearts against God. They know exactly why it happened. The whole area of the Indian Ocean where that happened did not have a tsunami warning system. The Pacific does. That area did not. And do you know why it did not? Because the countries couldn't afford it. And look at the countries that make up a large part of that so-called arc, if you like. The people that I have interviewed are so grateful to the love of God in Christ, the Christians that I've done. They're not angry with God. They're angry with their governments. They're angry with the elites. They're angry with foreign nations even. But they're not angry with God. Because if this loving God withholds his love and withdraws his love, then it's one step then to saying, well, he's a God not worth believing in. He's a God not worth trusting in. All I can say, sir, is that that was not the outlook of the people that I interviewed. And I certainly do not believe as a theologian that is the outlook that my theology leaves me floundering with either. In the gospel of Christ and in God's mercy, in coming into this world as Emmanuel, God with us. And we have huge evidence of God's love and mercy. And when you talk to the people who have gone through these things, then they will recount to you individual and communal experiences of them having felt that love towards them.
Great, yeah, Dave.
Can I ask a question about your theological framework
Yep.
that you went through. You talked about these natural phenomena becoming disasters because of lack of human wisdom
Yes.
working with nature, but you also quoted Genesis chapter 3,
Yes.
the fall narrative,
Yes.
and yet you also quoted someone who said, which I think is right, without earthquakes, without volcanoes, the atmosphere wouldn't be conducive for life.
David Hart. That's
So how do you bring those strands together?
yeah.
Because I wasn't quite clear from
Sure.
what you said.
Sure. My line on, I believe in the fall. Let me put it that way, first of all, in the sense that I believe that when Adam and Eve, either as representatives or as individuals, chose to take the law into their own hands, if you like, as to how they would address nature or what they would do in the garden, what they wouldn't do, then they forfeited that relationship with God, which they could have had, and which would have increasingly given them that wisdom as to how to handle nature. They lost that wisdom. They were put out of the garden into the wilderness, as it were. And then there was a big problem, and I don't think we've ever got over that problem. I don't think we will ever get over that problem completely until the eschaton, which is why we just thank God that there is an eschaton in a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness and wisdom will dwell. But that does not excuse, which is a point I think that many of us as Christians need to take to heart, that does not excuse forfeiting our responsibility. We could easily act on that view and say, well, these things are going to happen. There's nothing we can do. They're always going to happen. We just have to pray that the eschaton will come soon and then we'll all be happy. That is a terrible dereliction of our responsibility before God. And therefore, we do have that responsibility. And we must get at that responsibility. And this is the burden, if you like, the passion of the way my research is leading me.